David Copperfield, Chapter 4. School Begins. School began the next day. The loud voices in the schoolroom suddenly became quiet when Mr. Creakle entered. He stood in the doorway looking round upon us like a master surveying his slaves. "Now, boys," began Mr. Creakle, "this is a new term. Make sure you do your lessons well, because there will be trouble if you do not. You will be severely punished, and you won't be able to rub out the marks that I will give you. Now, all of you get to work." With this, Mr. Creakle came to where I was sat and showed me his cane. He told me that it was famous for biting too, and brought the cane down on my hand. I cried out in pain. Traddles was an honourable boy, and thought it was our duty to stand by one another, and had often suffered because of it. Once Steerforth had laughed in church, but it was Traddles who was accused and severely punished. Traddles did not tell Mr. Creakle who had really laughed, and the poor boy was looked up for many hours. Steerforth said that Traddles was a good friend, and Traddles was happy with these words of praise. I believe that no man had ever enjoyed his profession more than Mr. Creakle. He delighted in hitting and marking the boys, especially the younger ones. I remember the look in his eye when he was hitting the boys, and then watching them try to rub away the marks with their handkerchiefs. One good thing came of my beatings. Mr. Creakle realized that my sign was in his way when he wanted to hit me with the ruler, and so it was taken off, and I did not have to wear it again. Sometimes at night, before we fell asleep, I told stories to Steerforth, which he really seemed to enjoy. The more imaginative and impossible, the better. One day I received a wonderful letter from Peggotty, together with a cake in a perfect nest of oranges. I laid this feast at Steerforth's feet and asked him to share it out to the boys in our room. In a school carried on by sheer cruelty, it was very difficult to concentrate on learning. Most of the boys were very ignorant, because they were always worried and afraid of being beaten. With Steerforth's help, I made use of my time at Salem House and managed to learn quite a lot of useful information despite the loneliness and the cruelty of the school. I was very pleased when I was with Mr. Mill. He liked me and taught a lot of subjects. I am sad when I remember how rudely Steerforth treated him and encouraged other boys to do so. This troubled me a lot, especially as I had told Steerforth about the old woman that Mr. Mill had taken me to see. I was always afraid that Steerforth would mention this visit and torment him with it. I was right to be afraid. One day when Mr. Creakle was absent, there was a lot of noise coming from the classroom. We were always much happier when Mr. Creakle was not around. It was a Saturday, and as Mr. Sharp was out getting his wig curled, Mr. Mill was in charge of the school. The boys started jumping out of their seats, making faces, and mimicking Mr. Mill's poverty, his boots, his coat, and his mother. "Silence!" cried Mr. Mill, suddenly standing up and striking his desk with the book. "What does this mean? What is going on? This behavior is not acceptable. How can you do this to me, boys?" It was my book that he struck his desk with, and as I stood beside him, I saw the boys all stop. Steerforth was lounging with his back against the wall, with hands in his pocket. He looked at Mr. Mill and began whistling. Mr. Mill looked at him. "Silence, Mr. Steerforth," he said. "Silence yourself," said Steerforth, turning red. "Who do you think you are talking to?" "Sit down," said Mr. Mill. "Sit down yourself," said Steerforth, "and mind your own business." Boys clapped, but Mr. Mill turned so white that they immediately stopped and became quiet. "If you think, Steerforth," said Mr. Mill, that I don't know of the power you have over the boys here. You are mistaken. You hold a very powerful position in this school because you are a favorite of Mr. Creakle. Steerforth replied that he did not waste his time thinking about Mr. Mill at all. "And you abuse your good position here," continued Mr. Mill, his lips trembling, "to insult a gentleman." "A gentleman? Where is he?" interrupted Steerforth as he looked around the room. Traddles cried out, "Shame, Steerforth! Too bad! Only to be told to be quiet by Mr. Mill. You are insulting someone who is not fortunate in life and who has never offended you," said Mr. Mill, his lips trembling again. "By doing this you are being unkind. You can sit down or stand up as you please." He turned to me and said, "Copperfield, go on with your lesson." "Young Copperfield," said Steerforth, coming towards me. "Wait a minute, Mr. Mill. How dare you speak to me like that? You are a beggar. You should not be in this school." Suddenly all the boys froze. Mr. Creakle was standing in the doorway with Tongay at his side. Mr. Mill, with his elbow on his desk and his face in his hands, sat quite still. Mr. Creakle turned to Steerforth. "What is all this about?" Steerforth did not answer for a long time. "What did he mean by talking about favourites then?" said Steerforth. "Favourites?" repeated Mr. Creakle. "Who talked about favourites?" "He did," said Steerforth. "And what did you mean by that?" demanded Mr. Creakle, turning angrily to Mr. Mill. "I meant, Mr. Creakle," said Mr. Mill in a low voice, "that no pupil has a right to make use of his favored position to insult me. Let me ask you, Mr. Mill, are you showing me proper respect when you speak about favorites?" shouted Mr. Creakle, folding his arms. "It was not a sensible thing to do, sir. I am willing to admit that," said Mr. Mill. "I would not have done so if I had not been so upset." Here Steerforth interrupted. Then he said I was rude and unkind, and I called him a beggar. If he is not a beggar, then his mother is. She lives on charity. Mr. Creakle turned to Mr. Mill and said, "You have heard Steerforth's accusation. Please contradict him before the whole class." It was deadly silent as Mr. Mill said quietly, "He is right, sir. Mr. Mill, I think you have mistaken this for a charity school." "You will leave as soon as possible," said Mr. Creakle. "There is no time like the present," replied Mr. Mill, getting to his feet. "I will leave you, Mr. Creakle, and all of you. James Steerforth, I hope that one day you will be ashamed of what you have done." He laid his hand upon my shoulder, and then taking some books and his flute from his desk, and leaving the key in it for his successor, he left the school. I was very sad at Mr. Mill's departure, as he had always been kind to me. Traddles was caned for accusing Steerforth of hurting Mr. Mill's feelings and making him lose his job. I think that Steerforth felt bad about what happened to Mr. Mill. He said that he would write to his mother to see that Mr. Mill received some money. We thought this was very nice of Steerforth, whose mother was a widow and would do anything for her son. I soon forgot about Mr. Mill. A new master was found and was introduced to Steerforth, who approved him. The new master came from a grammar school. I respected him a lot, but he never took any notice of me.